what I found is for a lot of men, it is hurtful. And I understand from the woman's standpoint, there's a lot of women that have been hurt. We have to acknowledge that, right? But it's like to help men get to the point where a lot of women feel that they need them to be, if we are using analogies like a bear of all things that you know is going to kill you, it does way more damage than good. And there are far more good men out there than there are these men who are lurking in the corners trying to hurt women. And women hurt men too. And so it's like to use a bear, it's just very unfair, and it doesn't encourage men to be like, oh, I'm going to go do my inner work now. Oh, I want to connect with a woman.
Steph, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. First and most important question is, how are you doing? Like, actually, for real, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. I'm a single mama, so there's the ups and downs, but as of right now, I think okay is the perfect word.
Yeah, what's okay mean to you? Like, is it borderline almost good, or is it like on the verge of almost bad, or is it just basically, right in the middle?
I think it means right in the middle for me. Like there's things that we just have to take with ebbs and flows, and okay, for me actually right in this moment does mean just right in the middle.
Yeah. Are you someone who sort of you thrive under maybe some chaos or stress? I mean, I think most moms do. Maybe that's inherent. At least my mom did. Like, she's a fucking superhero. Um, but
She is.
Yeah, I mean, all are, tip the cap to them. I think I mentioned my mom in every single episode I've ever done in this podcast because for like the first 280, she was the only one that listened. So I got to, I got to represent my number one fan. But anyway, speaking of you as a mom, yeah, do you, it's something you thrive under chaos? You get better even as like a young person, like, were you a procrastinator or things like that?
Oh, absolutely. I actually have a adult ADHD diagnosis, which I feel like everybody does, but I feel like my entire life makes sense, and I do. There's a certain amount of chaos that I thrive with, but I think the more experience I get in life, I do crave and value peace. So I'm definitely a lover of balance.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I'll turn 33 this year, and I just pictured myself 10 years ago, and I just like wanted to go to like the clubs and the bars and do all of this sorts of thing. And now just like even the thought of doing that just makes me want to fucking throw up.
Oh,
Yeah.
brings the sun, yeah.
So it's cool. It's cool to see that sort of trajectory and who's still in my life, and from that sort of time period, and how all that stuff is very interesting as you start to get older, and hopefully my wife and I will have kids soon, and then everything will totally even change
Oh, yeah.
beyond what I comprehend now. So I'll come back to you with sort of advice about trying to raise just so meaningful fruitful kids. But yeah, anyways, just to go on a little tangent there. So to actually jump in to the topic that I really wanted to discuss with you, I talk about it a lot, masculinity, on this podcast. But I like to get it from a female's perspective because I think that's very important, because most men, generally speaking, men are trying to attract women. Not in every, obviously not in every relationship or with every person, but the majority of people. And so getting that sort of perspective, I think is important to how they can understand themselves better. Um, but my first question to jump us off would be, how did you grow up thinking about masculinity or men or anything of that sort?
Um, if I'm being honest, I had a very traditional sense of the role, and in sort of in a negative way. And I don't think it's anything for me to. I'm not trying to say that my family and the representatives of masculinity did anything incredibly wrong, but it was very much a traditional. He is the head of the household. Men had the power. Men made the decisions, and that was kind of my model for masculinity. And so I don't know that it's necessarily anything that anybody did negatively, but it's just kind of what it is, right? And I just to kind of give you age reference for me is I'm 41, and so there is some generational stuff with that. um, and just kind of the expectations and the roles of what that meant. So it was very much, my I had a stay-at-home mother. My father went and provided, and that I think shaped my early views of what it was supposed to be. I obviously think differently now, and we'll get into that, but that's very much the beginnings of my understanding of what it was.
Did that shape your early dating life in terms of how you viewed what a man's role might be in your life for the future?
If I'm being honest, I think it did, right? Because I was coming from the perspective, you kind of, what you have seems normal to you. And I knew that I didn't want to be a stay-at-home mom with a traditional man once I got to be in about my teens, actually. And I realized that I don't really thrive in that sort of environment. And not that there's anything wrong with those that do, a more traditional route. But I realized that even though I was kind of subconsciously seeking out partners like that, it wasn't what I needed or really wanted.
Mm, yeah. It's interesting, like what you have growing up is either something that you want to run towards, or sort of run away from.
Sure.
Um, Yeah, because I've come up with sort of this idea of like reverse role models, which I think more people have than actual role models,
I agree.
especially when I'm around young people like coaching baseball and stuff. That coach can be that actual role model, but a lot of these kids are seeing these things that they want to be the opposite of. And that's very hard to sort of decipher as a young person. Like, I want to be something great. I see this person, like I'm going to sort of tend to do the opposite. And I think we almost inherently do that as kids because, like, our parents, they're the worst when we're younger, whether they're good or not, whether the household was good or not, right? It's always like I'm,
Everything.
I'm going to my room, I'm slamming the door, and I'm not talking to you. It's like even if the relationship is great, and then so that always seems very interesting, and I sort of foreshadow myself thinking about that, with my God willing future kids. But if you have any thoughts on that, please.
On future kids, or
Yeah, just
how.
anything, reverse role models, your idea of what you saw in a man and how that shaped your future.
Yeah, I definitely, looking at again at the traditional view and models I had, I very much saw the woman as a person not of power again, and we're looking at my past perspective. I don't view that this way now, but it was like a woman was to be acted upon. And so I think there's something to be said about this idea of, I don't want to call it equality. As I'm talking, I'm sure I'll come up with a better word, but this idea that there is, and I even posted about it today, there's the gender role paradigm, where research is actually showing that it's more about who we are as a person and our personality as opposed to what our gender roles are. Like, yes, there are some hormonal differences, obviously, and some biological differences, but our representations of what those are, aren't as solid as we think. And in terms of like the gender role paradigm and expression of gender, most of us express it somewhere in the middle. And so when we have these expectations that a lot of us did grow up with of, well, this is how a man is and this is how a woman is, a lot of times we'll try to put ourselves into that role, and it does a lot of emotional damage because it's not really who we are. It's not authentic to the self. So even take the example, we're both athletes. You're a college athlete, I was too. That's pretty normal for a guy. And while that has changed, in my generation it was less common. And I even had neighbors talk to my parents about, you sure you want her to be an athlete, because you know what girl athletes mean, like questioning my gender even in that regard. And so it's
Oh.
like this conversation of what it means. I think we need to understand that there's a broader spectrum than what we always realize.
Yeah, it's an important point. Like, I mean, I think we all are going to have sort of biological tendencies, like you're mentioning, but the discovery of who you are as a person is like sort of the greatest thing in life. And then trying to express that authentic version of you is like the most beautiful thing that can happen. And that may be as a stay at home mom, that may be in the workforce, being a fucking badass lawyer, just, crushing people. Have you watched the show Landman recently? On And so there's this woman lawyer who starts working in the oil fields. And she doesn't really know much about the oil fields, but she's a killer. And she's getting out there, getting after it, protecting herself and doing these sorts of things. Now, maybe people don't see that as like a normal sort of role for a woman because she's being very assertive and dominating. But a lot of people have to do that in their life, and maybe that's where she feels most alive, and you can see it on her face, and you can like
Right.
see it and the way she expresses herself. Like I'll take my wife for example, right? She's a manager of some people at her job, and the people in her team are like a few men. She has to talk to them in a certain way to get them to do fucking things that she needs to get done, right? Like it's pretty simple. Like any manager has to do that. Doesn't matter male or female, but she happens to be a female and they happen to be male. And then when she gets off work, she doesn't want to be that way with me. She just wants to like relax and whatever the case may be. So there's sort of you can do different roles as long as you're in the role that you're being authentic to yourself in that sort of space. But I think that could be hard for people to sort of conceptualize, because like maybe it feels like we're not being authentic, or we're shape shifting, or we're pretending to be something that we're not. But yeah, that's it's valuable insights for people to take sort of in any domain they go into in their life.
Sure. And I think the difficulty is because you mentioned, your wife going out and being a boss lady, and then she comes home and she has softness. The reality is men need to do the same thing, whether they want to admit it or not. And when they don't, it does cause internal discord. It does cause, mental health orders or disorders or issues or whatever else. And society has allowed women greater permission to do that, whereas men are not allowed the full spectrum yet.
Yeah, yeah, it's getting better. It's getting
Yeah,
better.
thankfully.
Which is nice. There's this guy on Instagram called at Man Talks. His real name is like Connor Beaton, and he's amazing. He's just talking about feeling feelings and things of that nature, and also just sort of walking that tightrope of when to deploy these sorts of things, when not to deploy these sorts of things. I mean, that's the marker of like a really great human, is sort of discernment in any type of area of your life. But we'll get into that in sort of how I think of masculinity. But when did your view shift, and what do you think about it now in the present day?
Yeah, so it was gradual, but I think the major shifts, I've been divorced twice and I'm very open about it, and people can think whatever they want about that, but the reality is having two experiences that were similar but different. I started to wake up and I was like, wait a minute, like what number one, I had to take ownership and say, what part am I playing in this as a woman in my relationships? And number two, what are these patterns that I'm seeing in not only my ex-husbands, but ex-boyfriends, my male friends, just any sort of, where am I seeing my paradigm being shifted? Where have I been wrong? Where, what do I need to start looking at? And even having a son who didn't quite fit what I perceived the social norm to be at that time. And that's when I really started to wake up. And in addition to that, too, being a teacher and being an English teacher, if students are vulnerable with you and they write, you kind of get a picture of their inside world. And sometimes what they write to you doesn't really match what they're showing to their peers. And that had happened a couple of times. And I was like, huh, maybe there's more than what meets the eye to men. And it really started to open my world.
And then where'd you go from there? Did you start doing research? How'd you start thinking about it differently?
Yeah.
What came about from that?
Yeah, so I definitely started to shift. I started reading, but then I did go get a formal degree, and my degree is actually it's a master's of education. And I did a case study in my classroom, seeing if I could do appropriate things within the context of education, to start looking at how boys could get in touch with their emotional selves, because there's a term called suppression. And, like you said, things are getting so much better. And I'm so grateful, even within just the last 5 years, since I've been doing my research, but there are still especially in more traditional societies, there is this issue where there's this suppression that boys especially have to deal with, or they're not considered, you know, um, a real man or whatever you want to call it. And so I used art in a case study in my classroom, and the results were just fabulous, because the boys came to me, in fact, and said, there's not many places I can be myself, but your classroom is one of those places because of what I was doing.
Hmm. Is there any other results from that case study that are worth sharing and presenting?
I think just the willingness that the boys had to be open with not only me, but each other. So I have a whole bunch of art, which is art can be used as documentation. And the vulnerability that they were willing to put into that was really quite beautiful. And the conversations that we were able to have, part of the case study was also reading literature. There's a book called The Monster Calls, and it's about a boy who loses his mother to cancer. And some of the journal rights and conversations that that I got from the boys as well was very, um, really beautiful and very vulnerable appropriately.
Yeah. We we do feel our emotions very deeply. Like I think that's a sort of a misconception that we just there nothing happens. We're stoic and all things are no, we feel that shit super deep.
Yeah.
But like you're saying, then it's like, oh, I can't feel this thing, move it to the side, like let it go. And then at some point that thing is going to boil over no matter what. Like it has to go somewhere. And so it's not about, you know, me always being mushy and crying on the bathroom floor, but like I've done that. Sometimes it feels nice and it's good to let things out, especially if you have someone there to support you or love you or whatever the case may be. But it's about feeling this thing that's coming on. Like we'll use anger, for example, because that's like sort of an emotion that's tied to men because some things happen and we do things and we lash out and whatever the case may be. But you're allowed to feel that anger. It's then recognizing that I'm feeling this anger and then what am I doing about it in this moment? If I'm having an argument, a conversation, whatever you want to call it, and like, okay, I'm starting to feel like a little bit angry here. Can I take 5 minutes and leave? Can I do this? Can we come back to this in 20? Like there are certain mechanisms that you can use, but the first step always has to be like, I'm actually feeling this thing. This thing is real.
Yep.
Like I'm
Yep.
feeling it. You know, I got to face that head on and be like, okay, I got to, like you can use the attack mentality for your emotions. I'm going to attack these emotions because when you attack something, you actually admit that it's in front of you and it's real and you want to face it. Then, okay, what do I do about it? Then that actually becomes the work, you know, whether you want to join a men's group or talk to a therapist or whatever the role is for you to do that work. I mean, but step number one is actually saying to yourself, like, dude, you're feeling this thing.
Yeah.
You know, and so that's where sports really helped me a lot. I know there is a toxic side to sports that, you know, we could talk about in terms of our mental health and all those things, but there is something to be said about how you can handle your emotions inside of a sporting context that can relate to sort of a real life situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I love everything you said, and I'm gonna kind of tag onto that.
Please.
One of the things, this idea of identifying emotions, right? There's another thing that I did in my case study where alexithymia is it's called. Research has showed that both men and women can do this, but it's more typical in men, right? Where they don't even have the words for that feeling that they feel, and they're so disconnected with their body that they don't understand the signs or why their body is doing a certain thing. So a really obvious thing, you know, your palms are sweating, you are therefore nervous, you know, and being able to identify that. Um, and part of the case study was teaching the kids through a program that was okayed by my district to do that. And as I was teaching them, I was also learning and also looking at the men in my life. And I'm like, do they know how to do what you just described? And I think it shows a lot of emotional intelligence on your part. And we as a whole society need to figure out how to do that because the next step after identifying is then regulating. And regulating is such an important skill for relationships, just personal well-being, and you know, bringing up sports again, for a lot of us that is a way to express it in an appropriate place and an appropriate time and gets those body movements going that can also help us regulate.
Yeah. I mean, I learned vulnerability through sports.
I love
I
it.
just had to, when I became an adult, I had to connect the ideas together. Because I think when guys hear vulnerability, again, they think like, I'm going to pour out all my emotions all the time and I'm going to be like this little soft pillow man. That's like the opposite of what it is. Like, it's like, if you think courage is a good virtue, which it is, and truth is a good virtue, which it is, you put those two together, you get vulnerability. And when you do anything in front of people where you could potentially fail, that's vulnerability. So when you're going out in a sporting event and you're playing in front of, it could be a youth team and there's 20 people there. There's still people who potentially are going to talk shit about you if you fail when you leave. Like, and that's vulnerability. That is, you're putting yourself out in front of people for them to judge. And that's the same thing with our emotions. We just have to connect it to something that we already know how to do. And so if I want to express how much I love my partner, which we need way more than sort of this sort of macho stuff, like one is way more important than the other. They're both equally important. Yeah, someone might attack you. Sure, I understand that. It's important. But to be able to express yourself in a way is much more important. And I was, you know, thinking about all this as I was getting ready to get married and thinking about how I was going to write my vows and like how do I express that this woman that I want to spend the rest of my life with her. And you have to really you have to dig up some things that you didn't think were there and you have to relate them to other stuff that you know how to do, and so you actually do know how to do this skill. And I think when talking to men, that's can be super powerful. It's not just like, hey, dude, be vulnerable, be in touch with your emotions. Yeah, those things might be accurate, but like, what is the line that I can pull on that's going to connect me to something I've already done so I can actually do this thing? Now, there are tons of men too who are just completely disconnected, like you said, and they got to start from ground zero and build them up from there. But it's also very possible. But yeah, anything to tag along on that.
Yeah, actually, I think part of the difficulty with expressing vulnerably is knowing whether or not you're going to be met with empathy.
Oh
And
yeah,
that has surprised me in my research because everybody's familiar with Brene Brown. But and she's even admitted this, and she's starting to look at this, the more masculine side of it, is there's something called action empathy, where it's not necessarily, sitting around and braiding each other's hair and kumbaya and I'm so sorry. And there is a component to that men can and do at the right time and place. But the other part of it is there's, hey, I'm giving you a slap on the back and we're making a joke, because that's how guys relate. And that's still okay. That's still a version of empathy. And I think sometimes that's something misunderstood by women and even maybe men themselves, where, there's this, again, spectrum of men and how masculinity is expressed. And it's like those that need the softer response, that's okay. And they need that. But if they don't get it, action empathy is still just as valuable, just as important, and just as much a part of empathy.
yeah, yeah. I think you've seen action empathy, whether we had the phrase for it or not, in men's groups, because usually what happens in these groups is they go out and they do something physically demanding, which basically says like, I'm in the trenches with you, dude. This is cool. We're doing something hard together. Then what happens later is they sit down and they start to chat, and then they start to just, hey, I haven't had a good relationship with my wife for the last 7 years. We haven't had sex in 4 years. I don't know what to do. I'm at my wits end. Like then the emotions start to come out and they're like, wow, I haven't told anyone that ever. It's like, well, you just did something real hard with this person and you like immediately respect them. And so you want to share those details. And it's an environment that's safe and people aren't going to judge you and they're going to give you, this validation and all of that stuff is like sort of preemptive with that. But that's a powerful mover for men is to, do use our bodies and know that our masculinity is useful and helpful. And then there we share these things that potentially we haven't shared with anyone. And then there's the ability to build that bridge to feeling better, looking better, feeling better, having better relationships, whatever the sort of the end goal might be.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And I even had women come and ask me when I gave a presentation at my university that I got my degree in. They're like, "Well, how do I get my partner, my male partner, to open up to me?" And I was like, "Number one, go do something with him, right? Even if it's shoot baskets or hike or video games. Even if he's not, who cares if you're not into it? He will start to open up. And once he starts to open up, we cannot make it about us. Do not make it about you. So it's like, he's saying stuff that even if it's about you, there's a tendency, and you can speak to this better on the men's side, because I don't claim to be a 100% expert on what it means to be a man and have that experience, right? That's you. But what I've noticed is it's like as soon as a man starts to speak to a woman, she might start, well, I feel that too, and you have to be careful because there's some sort of relation that you have in expressing empathy. Well, yeah, I felt that too, but also there's a shift in that conversation where it's no longer about him and it shuts that vulnerability down. And understanding what that line is for each individual person in relationship is crucial in allowing that openness to be cultivated.
Mm. Yeah, a couple things on that actually. I just had this woman who wrote a couple books on empathy. She's like an empathy strategist, and she coined this term. Her name is Maria Ross, and she coined this term called empathy hijacking, which is
Mm,
exactly what you're talking about. And to pair it with another company that's a mental health company called Active Minds, they came up with this slogan called VAR, which is validate, appreciate, and refer. And so if someone's coming to you and they say anything, this man is opening up to you or and your friend, like it's just a normal conversation, the first two steps are always going to be validate and appreciate. Hey, Steph, it's just been, really hard for me to get out of bed the last couple days. Now, if you're hijacking the conversation, you're gonna be like, "Oh, I have all the answers. Here's what I did. Let's make it about me." Right? And I'm not saying that people are coming from really good intentions at that point because they are trying to give you practical, helpful tools, and it's coming from love, and I get it. But now you're hijacking the conversation. It's no longer about me, even though I just expressed this really vulnerable thing that may seem like something little to you, but I haven't told anyone. And now I'm telling you that I haven't been able to get out of bed recently and I'm not feeling very well. So you validate that. You're like, oh, Aaron, man, I'm sorry you're going through that. And the appreciate part is like simply just telling someone that you appreciate the courage for them for speaking out. It's like literally in the name, like, I appreciate you. Thank you for telling me that. I know it's hard. Now you've built this sort of bridge. Then the refer step is really the action step. Now you can now you can ask them a question like, because Steph, you've been so kind in validating and appreciating me, you're no longer hijacking because now it's just a conversation. Now you're asking me, well, Aaron, like, hey, I went through this like 2 months ago and here's what I did. Would you like to like talk about that? And maybe we can go through some action steps. There we go. That's a much better conversation. Or if you're a student or a peer and this happens at school, refer could be, hey, you want me to walk you to the counselor and we can talk to her together. I know you maybe been a little nervous about it and this might be the best course of action. Or, hey, I know you've been thinking about signing up for therapy. Maybe we'll just sit down and I'll help you sign up. Like those are refer questions or refer statements, but you've already built this connection with someone because you validated and appreciated them. There's no longer this room for empathy hijacking. When you do start to talk about yourself, people feel more inclined to listen because you've already heard and seen them, and it can be a powerful, really connection. And I just found those two things to be very, connected and helpful in terms of having conversations like that.
Yeah, yeah, I agree 100%. I literally have nothing to say better than what you just said. So I agree
Yeah.
entirely.
Yeah, people should check both of those. Maria Ross, her books out, and Active Minds is a mental health nonprofit. They do great work, mostly for schools, which is where our kids need sort of the most help in getting these tools that are available to them to be proactive about their mental health. But yeah, so have you have you seen this man versus bear? To just sort of really flip the script here, uh, have you? We'll get back to sort of your actual what masculinity in a second, but this has a lot to do with it. Have you seen this sort of man versus bear conversation?
I have, and I even made a post about it, and I debated about it for like a week, but I even had conversations with several men, like some coworkers, male friends of mine, about this analogy. And what I found, a lot of people have a lot of opinions.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
but what I found is for a lot of men, it is hurtful. And I understand from the woman's standpoint, there's a lot of women that have been hurt. We have to acknowledge that, right? But it's like to help men get to the point where a lot of women feel that they need them to be, if we are using analogies like a bear of all things that you know is going to kill you, it does way more damage than good. And there are far more good men out there than there are these men who are lurking in the corners trying to hurt women, and women hurt men too. And so it's like to use a bear, it's just very unfair, and it doesn't encourage men to be like, oh, I'm going to go do my inner work now, oh, I want to connect with a woman, because it creates this why even try narrative societally, and that's not going to create unity for any of us. So I I strongly oppose the analogy, even though I understand why it exists, but it's just a very extreme case. And I understand also that it's a strange man and a bear, right? But I'm sorry, I honestly would prefer to be with a strange man. Now, one other comment to that, so I kind of be honest about my own bias. I am 5'11". I've only dealt with assault once in my life, and part of that is because of my size. So maybe if I was a smaller woman, would I feel that way? I don't know. But I just still feel that it's extreme and it's not doing good to help unify society at all.
yeah. That's a really really important point. Is that we're already divided between men and women. And that's not good. That's not good for the fabric of society, the future of our society, our future kids, future relationships, future communities. And it does for most men to hear that, it breaks our heart because ultimately we do want to be great to women. We do. Like that's a driving factor for sort of, earlier when we're younger, it's like, okay, what can I do to have sex with girls? But like, you know what I mean? But as you like, why we start working out, dressing nice, showering more often, whatever the case may be. But like, as you start to get older and you start to mature, it's like, okay, how can I build like a really beautiful, powerful, reciprocal, cooperative relationship with a woman? And to hear that some women, I don't know if it's most, all, I'll just say some women would rather pick a bear than a man, it's super, super heartbreaking. And I understand from the perspective of the women who've been like essayed. Like I understand that you just don't want to be with a random man because you had so many, or just one is too many traumatic, painful, horrible events. I get that. That makes sense.
Right.
But then I think you get clouded by the 90% of men that you met that haven't done that to you, or have been great to you, or have been kind to you, or have come up to you and bought you a drink at the bar, and then you said you were not interested and they just walked away and said, all right, sounds good, thank you for your time. Like, you haven't thought about all of those men. And I get it, in the midst of a conversation in the podcast, there's a lot of people watching, you're immediately going to like the worst moment of your life and saying, I would rather be with the bear. And so I get all of that, but if we can just sort of start to have more honest conversation about how we can be better for each other, then I think it's also important. And there's also an element of accountability. And I like this Dr. Jordan Peterson quote. He says, if all of the women in the world don't find you attractive, it's not the women's fault. It's it's not. It's your fault, right? It's my fault. If all the women in the whole entire world don't ever find me attractive, it's not their fault. They obviously are correct because I've done something wrong. But that doesn't mean I'm a piece of shit. I'm horrible. I'm bad. I suck. It just means there are things that I need to work on and take accountability for, and then start to progress and move forward as I take ownership over my life. Then over the 3-5 year span, now I might become attractive to a few women, and that's more than zero. And this is a longer game that we can start to play, but there has to be accountability on both sides, and the sort of the starting from a point where, like, I respect the other side, I respect the female, I respect the male. And if we start from that place, I think we can see the other person's humanity just a little bit more, rather than saying, you know, of course I would rather be with a bear, all men fucking suck and they should die. Like, that's like we're not going to get anywhere with that. And the same if men, all we do is just blame women for all of our problems, even though they have fucking nothing to do with it because we have ownership over our life. That's not helpful at all either. And so there's a, you know, conversation on both sides. But if you have anything to say, you know, off my riff.
Yeah, absolutely I do. I love, love, love ownership because that's the pathway to healing. I mean, who hasn't been hurt by somebody from the opposite gender? And I know I've hurt men, mostly unintentionally, right? Sometimes I get a
Right.
little revengeful in certain circumstances, and I say that because it's important to be transparent, right? So one of my most popular posts actually is when I had admitted that, making that transition from how I think now from where I thought before, some of my earlier dating, there was a man who was vulnerable to me, and I wasn't being unkind. I genuinely did not know what to do with his vulnerability. And he
Mm,
started to get teary eyed, and I changed the subject. And I was like, oh, okay. Because I did not identify or see or even realize how badly he wanted to connect with me. And I thought he was going to get embarrassed if I let him continue, that maybe he
mm.
was emotionally spiraling out of control. He dumped me, thank goodness, because he had the wherewithal. I asked him, he said, I couldn't be vulnerable to you. I only halfway knew what he meant, and I knew it was at that exact moment that he was talking about where he couldn't be vulnerable with me. And that, honestly, back to your other questions too, was the catalyst for me to go, oh, I have a part in this too. And that ownership has been so powerful in my life. And I know there are more well meaning women out there like me, and maybe even men, where it's like, where are my blind spots so that I can increase this unity? I can be a safe space for other people.
Mm. Did you find his vulnerability to be unattractive, or you just didn't understand what to do with it?
Not unattractive. I honestly would have married the guy if he had kept dating me.
Okay.
What it was is, for me, because I've heard that, women,
Hmm.
it's like, oh, you just shared with me and now you're not a man. I can honestly say I've never been that way. It was, I did not know what to do with it, and I didn't want him to feel embarrassed. And I felt a little bit embarrassed by it, but it didn't make me find him unattractive.
Mm. Yeah, because that's a lot of fear of men, is that if I open up to a woman, then she's going to find me weak and soft and be, you know, unattractive. Then she's going to break up with me. I don't feel like I have the view that my wife is not my best friend. Now, some people might disagree with that. I have best friends. Like, my wife supersedes those people. She's higher than that. She's my wife. And so there are certain things that I tell my boys that I just feel like this easy to tell them. Okay, great. Boom. And then my wife obviously gets the most important stuff. But there are certain things that, like, I don't know, maybe people think that I should, I'll get some heat for this or not communicating fully with my wife, but I just don't, I don't view it that way. I see them as two separate things. So I think as men, we can tell certain things to our buddies, our boys, that we don't necessarily need to tell our wife. Like, I'm not saying lie. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there are certain elements that can be separated so that I can be an integrated, healthy, masculine man for my wife or partner, while telling some of these things to my boys to get it off my chest, to be more free, to get some solutions to the problem, so that when I maybe eventually do come to my wife and tell her there's already an answer to the question, I just want to let her know. So I'm very honest and open. Um, some people say your partner should be your best friend. I just don't, I don't view it like that. And I've like, obviously me and my wife have talked about this so much that in her vows, she was like, and I vow not to be your best friend. And it was very funny. We just have it, obviously, but like, I just see her as above that. And she's my wife, she's my life partner. But I do think that what romantic movies have gotten wrong for us is that they've told us that this person that we marry is everything all the time and they're going to save us. And I'm like, that's just too much. That's too much for her to bear. Like, she's supposed to be everything to me all the time. She's supposed to have sex with me. I'm supposed to have sex with her and be my best friend and hang out and watch movies and do, oh my God, it's fucking exhausting. Like, so to me, I just didn't think that she should be my savior. She did save my life, but that's like a different thing. She came into a perfect time, saved me from whatever the fuck I was doing. But that's like sort of a different thing. But like now, it's like, I don't know. That's just how I view it. Maybe I didn't vocalize that well, but whatever.
No, I have lots of ideas and comments actually, and I totally get what you're saying. And I do think it's couple to couple. So that things that you love, that I love that you said, is that you guys are communicating about it. So you know where that line is for each of you. Sometimes people misunderstand like my platform and my research, and what I say is it's like, you need vulnerability with your partner to connect with them. But I love how you said there's certain things that you tell your guys. There's certain things I tell my girls that my significant other may or may not understand just because it's more of a feminine issue. He may or may not want to hear about it. It doesn't mean I'm not going to tell him, but I may tell him differently than I tell my girls, or I may
Mhm.
tell them first. And, I'm an external thinker as opposed to an internal thinker, and I need to work it out before I present it to him in a way that he can understand. Um, the other thing too is like, it's important. You mentioned a partner not being a savior. I would also say your partner doesn't need to be a therapist. There are things that I address with my therapist and not my partner. And I think people misunderstand that too, where it's like this vulnerability needs to be selective and appropriate for each relationship, especially within a partnership. So I think, again, you have to know and understand where your partner is. I do tend to like more of a best friend for my partnership, but that's okay. And it's okay that for you, you think she's above, like, that's wonderful. It works for you. And I think being self aware enough to know how much vulnerability goes where, right? And what that means in each other's role, it's completely different and up for interpretation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite fun. It's quite entertaining to sort of figure it out, on your own. Because I feel like if I'm trying to have a relationship that's going to last forever, hopefully, God willing, and be the best relationship I've ever had, maybe outside of my future children, again, God willing, then there's got to be me also as a fully fledged human where I can make myself happy and fulfilled,
Yes.
but everything about her makes my life better. And so I think that's this is how I view it. And so we do things separately. She plays in this league, I play in this league. We go to the gym separately. All these, we have different friends, together friends, but like our time together is important. And so I think that's also important for a relationship. Like, I can't spend every waking moment with her. It's like, I love her more than any human that's ever existed ever on the earth. But like all the time, no, we have to have separate interests
Mhm.
that when we come back together, we're like, oh, I fucking missed you today. How was your day? Freaking sweet. Tell me all
Mhm.
about it. That's great. Love that for you. She has a book club. She went to this like third wing thing the other night about some dragon book. I don't know. I feel like I should know more about it, but it's amazing. She hangs out with her friends. She came back. It's awesome. Loved it. Now she reads the book and we have something to talk about and something that interests her and gives her joy. And it's not solely reliant on me making her happy all the time, because that's impossible. I'm never going to be able to do that. And so I think those are some foundations for a great relationship, at least that I found. Maybe some people do it differently. Great, whatever works for you, as long as you feel happy and fulfilled and everyone's safe and all of that stuff. But that's how sort of I found. I mean, I'm only like 6 months into my marriage, and we've only been together about 3.5 years, so I'm no expert. But when I listen back to this podcast with you, Steph, in 50 years, where it's just like probably it's like animated and comes out fully into my whole room and we could see each other hologram style. You can let me know if I was right or wrong, or I just totally fucking missed the mark.
You know what? One other thing that I have to highlight that you said that I 100% agree with is this idea that you have a guy tribe or whatever you want to call it. There's something to be said. And I, again, this wasn't common, even 5, 10, 15 years ago, but having those men that you can be, I hate to keep repeating myself, but appropriately vulnerable with, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is something that all men need. And I don't know that all men have, because we're not taught how to do it. It's not normalized, but that is like, mwah, bravo.
Yeah, yeah. Men are very lonely. We're very lonely.
Hmm.
And that's a part to our own doing, right? We got to get out there, but we as men are deeply, deeply afraid of rejection. Oh, it's like the fucking worst thing ever. Being rejected by a dude and by a female, it's both equally horrible. Again, that's why sports play a part in that, because in sports you learn that you fall, you get back up, you fall, you get back up, you fall, you get back up. There's this weird sort of adage in with baseball players is that we have this like reputation of like picking up the most chicks. And I'm like, no, we don't. We just shoot our shot more than anyone else because baseball is a game of failure. If I get a hit 3 out of 10 times, I'm the best player on the team. So if I talk to 100 girls and one of them likes me, then that seems like I have a high success rate. Obviously, I don't. I'm 1 for 100, but we're just willing to shoot our shot over and over again, which really means that we're better at handling rejection. So we go out into the real world and we try to get a job or apply for college or try to get dude friends. It's like, okay, this might not go well the first 100 times, but man, that 101 could be amazing. And everyone can learn how to face rejection. It's just part of the deal. It's part of the human experience. If we got everything we wanted all the time, I think it would kind of be boring. And what would be the point? What would be the juice of getting the actual thing that we do want? And so there is something to be said about going out there and just making a bunch of mistakes and trying and trying and trying, but then actually the adult part is learning from those mistakes and then not repeating them over and over again. And so I think that's an important piece that some people miss when they hear like, oh yeah, I can go out and make mistakes. Yeah, you definitely can and definitely should, but there's got to be some sort of adaptation or adjustment as your behavior moves forward so you're not repeating those things.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And I love that you bring that up because because culturally how we function as far as like dating and pursuing a partner, men do deal with a lot of rejection. And I cannot even imagine what that feels like, what that looks like. I have no experience with that, obviously. I mean, not that I don't have experience with rejection, but the repeated that men do. So I think it's important to highlight that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's less now because of social media and the dating apps and you know, guys are afraid to walk up to girls in a bar because they're afraid to be seen as creepy. The gym environment is just wild. I mean, oh man. But anyways, that's besides the point. We could talk about dating for maybe another time. But let's get back to sort of now we have this idea of masculinity. When you think about that and how you've done all this research and gone from your former views to your current views, is there sort of a definition or phrases or words that you would put in there to sort of define like an integrated healthy masculine?
Yeah, I get asked this all the time, and I think there's room again for interpretation for what others feel and what others express. But to me, it comes down to how a man expresses himself, whatever that is. It's okay. And I know that sounds like a really broad way to look at it, but there are men who are naturally more traditional, who are more rough and tumble, people who are natural athletes, and it's okay that that's his expression. There are guys that are better at chess and they aren't super athletic. It doesn't mean that they're any less of a man than these men who are uber athletic, right? And so for me, it just goes back to that gender role paradigm where it's what are you? Be authentic. Authenticity is masculinity.
Authenticity is masculinity. That's a beautiful statement. I've come to view masculinity as this idea of warrior poet.
Mhm.
And because I think there has to be both sides. And warrior, I don't mean like actually being. Some people do go to war and they become and go into the military, great. But I mean like warrior. I think now means standing up for yourself. That's what I think it means. I think being able to express what you need and what you want. It's very, very important inside of a relationship, inside of a job, and anywhere. Like most people just step back. I don't know, maybe. No, you got to be assertive about what you want, and sometimes you do have to protect yourself and your family. Like that just maybe it might happen. That's the warrior part. What's more important is the poet part, learning to express love, to be about beauty, to understand beauty, to see it, to be in the present moment, to be able to tell someone that you love them. I wasn't the first one to tell my wife that I loved her. She had to say it first. And I was like, oh yeah, I've felt it this whole time, but I've never said it to anyone. So I don't fucking know what to do. I'm very nervous. I'm very scared. Not that she wasn't going to say it back. Cause like I just didn't, the words just, I always thought they were going to come out, but they just never could. And I've said, I love you to my friends, my buddies, my parents, but never to like another female. And it was very challenging. And so you have to learn how to do that. And you have to understand how you can express those things. Those are always going to be the more important qualities than being the warrior. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't have those qualities too. You should possess them. You should possess the sort of, innate power in yourself that you can be the person you set out to be. And you can be dominant and dangerous in those sort of capable, best version of yourself ways. But the poet part is what we need to come to terms with a little bit more because it's more challenging. But it behooves you in life, an incredible amount. And I've learned that as I start to sort of progress in my manhood and also in my maturity. I think it comes with being more mature too. So we got to cut some slack for these young kids who are 15, 16, 17, 18, maybe all the way up to 25, who just haven't sort of figured it out yet. They're still learning what it is. Of course, we can teach them respect and all these sorts of very important qualities, but they're not going to flush out their manhood until they've experience more things. Now we need to give them better role models because the role models we presented to them aren't very good, but that's hard to control on social media. So hopefully, all young boys are watching this podcast and learning from us. But that's whatever. It is what it is. But anything to say off that?
Yeah, actually, I love your warrior to poet. There's actually a very similar quote. Terrence Real asked an African warrior what a man was, and he said pretty much what you did, where he used the word warrior, and I like how you defined that, all the way to being someone who is tender. So I like actually your word of poet, where it's just this ability to know what to do, when to do it, in the right place and time. And I mean, that's not only masculine, but that's even feminine, right? Knowing when and how, when to be a mama bear, when to be, obviously that's a different topic, but yeah, I think that's phenomenal.
Yeah. Well, Steph, is there anything that you want to talk about or hit that we did not, or that I missed, or that's important to you to discuss?
There is one thing, it's kind of out of the wheelhouse of my research. But when I was doing my interviews, because that was the other part of my research aside from my case study, I was doing interviews with adult men. And something that shocked me that we need to be talking more about, and I don't want to talk too much about it here because I don't, again, have a research base on it. But what I discovered was the high rates of sexual abuse among men when they were boys. Sometimes the perpetrators were women, sometimes the perpetrators were men. And I think and I've even have a lot of DMs come into me from my followers. They're like, please talk about this, please talk about this. And I
Hmm.
haven't done it formally on my page yet, but I do mention it just so it can be a conversation because at this point I am not adequate or qualified to talk about it. But there are people that are. And so as soon as we make it more of a conversation and say, hey, this is a problem, how do we help these men to be able to speak up without being ostracized, without being ignored and not valued and saying, well, you're a guy, that doesn't happen to guys. You can't have those experiences, because I think it's doing them a disservice when they need healing.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I'm also not, qualified to speak on sort of the severity of it and how often it happens, but from sort of anecdotal evidence that I've seen on social media from guys coming forward, I mean, they didn't tell anyone until their 40s or 50s about what happened to them when they were, you know, a young age, whether they're 4 to like 13 years old. And it's interesting to hear it happen to a young kid in high school who's like sort of a, and is not obviously age of consent, but he seems like he's 14, 15, and like, oh, you got to have sex with the teacher. It's not okay. And we get that sort of rhetoric around it, which makes it seem like it's cool. It's not cool. It's still grooming. It's still someone getting taken advantage of. It's still all of those things, but we just look at it in a different way. And I think what you're saying is extremely important, that we need to, address that a little bit more heavily, as it becomes, I don't know if it's becoming more prevalent or less. I don't know the stats behind it, so I can't speak on that. But once you do have that flushed out, and I'd love to bring you back on so we can dive into that topic as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Steph, thank you. Appreciate the conversation. Appreciate you speaking up for masculinity and for men, and for advocating for us to be full humans. That's very nice. We appreciate it. Thank you for not addressing us as toxic, because that is tired and old, and we don't like that anymore. But where should people go? Where are you most active on social if they want to see some of the stuff you've been talking about?
Well, I'm working on expanding right now. I'm still pretty small, and I'm most active on Threads. So
Yeah.
I'll go out from there, probably to Instagram next, and then we'll see where it takes me.
Yeah, that's where I found you. I saw the sort of the viral thread that you posted of like the list of 6 or 7 things. That was a great thread. People should read that if they're interested in the conversation we had here. And then, send us a message. Let us know what you think. But Steph, I appreciate your time. Appreciate the work you're doing. And thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you very much for tuning into that episode. And if you enjoyed it, click right here for another full-length episode of the podcast. And please don't forget to subscribe. But most importantly, above all else, please take good care of yourselves and others. And I'll see you next time. Lots of love. Cheers.